I'm going to invite all of you to open your Bibles to James chapter 4. We're going to be looking at a passage today that I think is very relevant for the end of the year, the start of the new year. And so I want to take you on a little bit of a journey. I know Sunday mornings you're not supposed to use your brain this much, but we're going to go on a mental journey. So you got your mind going. Turn up the hearing aids, definitely. All right, here we go. So this time of the year invites us to reflect on what has happened this past year. And so I want to ask you, as you consider this last year, the life that you've lived, what were the most interesting moments of this past year for you? Yeah. I heard, Interesting in some good ways. Interesting in some not so good ways. There were big moments in your life this last year, weren't there? Yeah. And so we need to reflect on those. We need to remember those. All of Scripture tells us to remember things that have happened in the past. So it's good for us to remember those, reflect on those. It would be good to even write those down, perhaps, on some of the most interesting moments over the last year. Did anyone face any challenges this last year? No. I see someone shaking their head. Let me remind you, the Bible frowns upon lying. Okay? No, we faced some interesting challenges. Did anyone learn a new skill or perhaps have a major change happen in your life this year? Is the Pope Catholic? That's a great question. So, yes, we've faced new challenges, major change over this last year. Hopefully, we have continued to learn some new skills and grow as human beings. What about this? What did you learn most about yourself in 2025? Maybe perhaps you learned that you were more resilient than you thought, or less. Some of you were humbled to know that you needed to count on others. Some of us had to learn different things about ourselves that we weren't necessarily going out looking for these revelations, but we had to learn them during this last year. But let me bring you to the biggest question over this past year. Where did you see God in your life? Hopefully, as you look back on 2025, you can see where God has stepped into those moments, who walked alongside of you, and sometimes, as the old poem says, that he carried you during this last year. And so, what I want you to do now that you've got 2025 in your view, in your perception, your perspective, let me ask you this. 1 year from now, what are we going to say? 1 year from now, as we look back, are we going to say that we've seen new challenges and we've gained new skills? Did we learn something new about ourselves this last year? But again, it comes back to the one question. Where did we see God in our lives, in our community, in our church over this last year? It's easy to talk about the plans we have for 2026. It's easy to think about where we want to go. Does anyone have a trip already planned for this next year? Not surprised at that hand that being raised. We have trips. We have things we want to do this next year. We have hopes that we want to accomplish We have goals, and there is nothing wrong with those. But I want you to see from the scripture, from text today, Pastor James is talking to his church about the exact type of moment that we are facing at the end of the year. As we look forward to what is going to happen next year, this seems very relevant. James chapter 4, we're going to read verses 13 through 17. So follow along in your own Bible, if you would, as I read. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such a city and spend a year there and do business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be. For you are like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you should say, if the Lord wills, we will live to do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So it is sin to know the good that you are supposed to do and yet not do it. So James here is dealing with this church, and they are making their plans. I don't know if it is the end of the year, but it seems like an appropriate time that he would be preaching this type of message at the end of the year. I don't know if they celebrated New Year's like we do nowadays anyways, but nonetheless, it seems like this type of moment that James is talking to his church, that God is using the scripture to talk to us today, and he's asking us these things. As we plan for next year, as we consider what our hopes and our ambitions are, the sobering question James asks is, what if God has different plans for you? Think about this last year, 2025. If you can recall back in January of this year, the plans that you thought you had for 2025, the trips that you were going to make, the things you were going to accomplish. Did anyone accomplish any of your plans for 2025? All right. Because you got moved into the house, huh? That was the plan. But some of you raised your hand, so that's good. You've made plans. You saw God accomplish that. But were there things that you wanted to do but weren't able to do? Yeah. Were there things that you did not even have on your radar, and yet that's what popped up in your life? Yeah. So God has his plans for us. Now, let me clarify something. There is nothing wrong with being active and having an imagination, having ambitions, to making plans for the next year. There's nothing wrong about those things. And Pastor James here, the Apostle James, is writing, he doesn't tell us to stop making plans. That's not the point of what he's saying, is not to make any plans at all. But he wants us to start planning differently. Because a lot of times we start making our New Year resolutions, which I don't think are very smart for us to make, because no one keeps New Year's resolutions. I think the study has proven that by January 15th, all New Year resolutions have been broken pretty much. So if you're making New Year's resolution, I don't want to be a downer. I don't want to put I don't want to diminish your ambitions, but the reality is resolutions don't really succeed. But we can make our plans. We can set our goals. We can have our dreams. That's not the problem. The only problem is this, that James is saying we forget to include God in all of our planning. We forget to look for God in those everyday moments a lot of times. And so it's easy to look with hindsight. They always say hindsight is 20/20, right? So we should be able to look on this last year and see perfectly all that God did, all that God had intended for our lives, right? We should be able to see those things and see where we were good and we obeyed God, and where we failed God. All that should come into clear focus at this time of the year. Yet some of us don't want to look back. We don't want to consider where this last year we might have failed or we missed God because we weren't looking for him. And James is just saying, listen, we're at a crossroads. You're at this point where you're standing between the past, what has happened this last year, what has happened in your life up until this point. You're standing, and that's in the past, and ahead of you is the future. Now, we don't know how much time we have in the future. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We can't tell the future, but we do know this. The future is ahead of us. So we're at a crossroads. Do we keep living in the past? Do we have our heads so far in the future that we miss the moment right now? And so as we think about 1 year from now, I want you to just put it all into perspective that really today is all we have. We can make our plans, but we've got to live in the moment as well. And as we prepare for this next year, as we prepare for all these things we hope to accomplish or we hope to do or the people we hope to see, hope to make contact with, we got to realize this. The way that we prepare ourselves actually reveals who we trust and who we think is really in control of our lives. James describes a radically different way to live in this world by asking that question, what if God has different plans than we do? But he does so in a unique way. So as we begin to look at this from his perspective, he starts with this. He doesn't talk about theology or some doctrine of God as he's talking about these plans. He doesn't even go over our own intentions. What he starts with is our plans. Exactly. He says here, come now, all of you who say today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such a city and spend a year there. He talks about those who are making plans. Well, that would be us. We're making plans. Well, some of us are. I don't know if all of us are, but we're trying to make plans for what this next year is going to bring. And so this is a message for us. The people he is talking to, they have clear plans of what they want to do. But I love the way he says it. Those of you who say today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such. Sounds like, man, he knows our culture, definitely. He talks in some generics, but yet they're specific. Today or tomorrow, we will travel to such and such a city. They're making clear plans with specific destinations, with specific goals and ideal outcomes. They're hoping to travel to a city to do business and to make a profit. Seems like good plans. The problem is not their ambition or the strategy that they have. The problem is that they have made their plans without involving God. So that's the real question. Do we actually involve God in our plans? Or is it that we say, here's my plans, God, bless them? I've known too many churches that's the way they do their planning. They present their budget and their calendar and they say, here it is, God, we've come up with all these great ideas, now bless it. God doesn't work that way. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, ever-present. So he says, that's cute. You think you have plans. Let me tell you the way this is going to go. And his way will always beat ours. His ways are higher than ours. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. He is completely different than us. But the wonderful thing about our God is he invites us into those moments with him. So while we make our plans, we should involve God. We should ask God, God, what is it you want to do? Now, I remember being asked this question. If you could, would you actually want to know what God has in store for you? I could tell you there's plenty of things in my life that I would not have wanted to know this was going to happen. So I'm not asking God to tell me all of everything for this next year. I just want him to tell me where he wants me to go tomorrow. What steps should I take next? I want him to be in charge of my plans. So as I look back, I can say, God, I did what you wanted me to do. I don't understand where I'm at. That's a common phrase I've said to God. I don't understand where I'm at or what I'm supposed to be doing. But God, I'm here because I've been obedient up until this point. So looking back, did you ask God what he wanted you to do? Can you say over this last year that you have seen more times where you were obedient to what God told you to do? Or were there times, a lot of times, where you said, I'm going to do my own thing? Our plans without God, well, that's just asking for trouble. That's just going to cause chaos in our lives. And James knows something about our plans. He knows that as human beings, we're assuming that we know how much time we have left. See, our time is limited. Our time is uncertain. If we were to try to do everything in our time, we would mess a lot of things up. James says it this way. He says, yet you do not even know what tomorrow will bring, for your life is but a vapor. You are a vapor here today and gone tomorrow. It vanishes quickly. Our time on this earth to do what God has called us to do is very limited, and we don't know when it's going to end. We have no idea. Sure, we can make plans. And as human beings, it's a unique part of the human experience to actually project ourselves into the future. Because we like to try to see ourselves 1 year from now, 5 years from now. You know, in the professional world, they tell you you should have a 1 year, a 5 year, and a 10-year plan for your life. Man, if I thought that I was going to be here 10 years ago, there would have been no way I could have even thought that this was going to be where God had me. So our time, we got to realize that it is very limited, and we have a very narrow view, a very small view of our time on this earth. So, as we think about this last year, if you knew what this last year was going to bring you, what would you have done differently? How would you have handled day-to-day activities? If you knew what this last year was going to bring you, would you have changed who you talk to or how you talk to them? Would you put different priorities on different things, different relationships? Life is uncertain. Life is limited. Life is fragile. We don't know how much time we have left. We don't know who is going to be with us next year, who we may lose. We can make plans without knowing how much time we have, all we want, but the reality that is that life is like a vapor. It can be snatched away like that. So putting this into perspective, we know that our plans, we need to involve God. And we know that our life is limited. So how should we go about looking at a new year? Looking at the future and preparing for it? How should we go about this? Well, we should just come to the reality that life is fragile and we don't have control over those things. So we should just start asking the types of questions that invite God into those moments with us. So why do we even think about 1 year from now? Why do we consider what life is going to be like 1 year from now? If tomorrow isn't guaranteed, James brings us back to the reality of why we make plans and why he's talking to us about these things. It's because it's all about God's will for our life. Yes, our plans can get messed up. Our life is so fragile, and some of us are very aware at how fragile life is because of this last year. But know this, God's plans, God's will always prevail. James says it this way, you should be saying, or you should ask, if the Lord wills, we will live to do this or that. Now, I've always read this as kind of like a cliche that James is throwing out there. Well, if the Lord wills, perhaps it's because I grew up and I was around these phrases, Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll be there. You know, it just sounds like some kind of phrase like that. Like James is saying, well, if the Lord wills, we'll be there for the potluck. If the Lord wills, we'll be there for the birthday party. If the Lord wills, no, it's deeper than that. This is not some passing phrase that you just attach and say, oh yeah, we're going to put God's stamp of approval on this. And if I don't make it, we're going to blame God because it's not God's will. No, this is really, we should be asking, God, what is your will for my life? What is it that you want me to do? See, this is a confession more than a cop-out or more than just a catchphrase. It's a confession of God decides if we will live. God decides if we will do this or that. God is in charge of my life. So if the Lord wills, these are my plans. Put God at the front of it. God's will is the priority here. Not what we want to do, but what God has in store for us. God is in control. And so God does have a plan for our lives. He has a future and a hope that He has put into place for us. And we know that God is for us, not against us, so we should be counting on His plan and doing His will. Now, this, by the way, does not eliminate our responsibilities. But instead, it rightly orders our responsibilities according to God's will. Let me remind you, perhaps, as we're talking about this, you're like, that sounds good, Pastor. I would love to know God's will for my life. And if you've ever asked that question, as I look around, I could remember several conversations, man, I wish I knew God's will for my life. Let me remind you just a little bit of what God's will is for our life. Micah 6:8, He has told each of you what is good and what the Lord requires of you, but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. If you don't know all the details of God's will for your life, start there. Let's start acting justly. Let's start loving mercy. Let's start walking every day humbly with our God. Man, I wish I could have been there in the garden like Adam was with God. Where every day at sunset, he just walked with God in the cool of the evening and just talked to Him as a friend, as a companion, knowing that He is a holy God who created everything, but yet being personal enough to know Him by name and to just share. Today was interesting. I got to see this creature. It was interesting. I had to face this trial. I had to deal with this person. And God's just listening and walking with us. but also Adam was listening as God talked. Yeah, I created that creature. Isn't the platypus interesting? See, God's will is not some abstract thing, like some far away idea. God's will is very personal, and James connects God's will to God's purpose in our life. So he says this, he says, it is a sin to know the good that you are supposed to do and yet not do it. See, God's will and God's purpose for our lives is never to walk us into sin. God does not tempt us with sin. And God's will never take us to where we will sin. God's purpose is always to keep us from sin and to make us holy. God's purpose in our lives is for us to do good in His name. To be the light of the world in a dark place. We are supposed to be that type of person to where we're living out God's will and God's purpose every day. God's purpose for our lives is obedience. Just simple obedience. To go where He tells us to go, to do what He tells us to do, to say what He tells us to say. That's God's purpose for our lives, because He will take us to the places we could never imagine we would go. Knowing God's will is, well, that's not enough, just knowing about God's will. Knowing what God's will is incomplete if we don't follow it up with obedience. Obedience is our act of worship to our God. It's saying that we trust God with all of our life. With every relationship, with every financial decision, with everything that we do, we trust God's will, God's purpose. Over our own plans, we trust that God is in control of every detail of our lives. The Bible tells us He knows every hair on our head. He knows every thought and intent of our heart. He knows everything about us. And so why not let Him be in charge of every detail of our life? You can trust Him. Jesus explains it this way, that doesn't God care for the birds of the field and for the flowers? Aren't they taken care of in every detail? Then why can't you trust God with those plans of your life? Why can't you trust God with the things that come up that aren't what you expected? And know that God has a purpose in all of it. So, the issue with us making plans for the next year, it's not about logistics. It's not about the details. It's not about all the things that we have included in what we're thinking about for next year. The problem is, the issue is, it's a heart issue. Do we really trust God? So my challenge to you is this. As we're looking to 2026, as we're looking to this next year, let's start off with saying, Lord, if your will, if it's your will in my life, I want to be obedient. Lord, if it's your will in my church, we want to be obedient. Lord, if it's your will in this community, we want to be a part of it. Because we trust your purpose, we trust your will over our plans, and we know that our time on earth here is limited, so God, use us. God, involve us in what you're doing because we want to be a part of it. We want to be your people. So as we begin this new year, As some of you may even begin a new season of life. Some of you may be facing new jobs or new relationships. Ask this question: God, what is your will for my life? And how can I serve you? And how can I serve others with what's going on? And let's see what 1 year from now, what it would be like if we have a service like this and where we ask, God, where were you moving this last year? And we could say, God, I've seen you here. I've seen you at this moment. I've seen you in this relationship. I've seen you in this crisis where you protected and cared for me. I've seen you provide in ways I never thought could happen. And God, I give you all the glory and honor because you are worthy. So what will we say 1 year from now? Hopefully we'll look back and say God was in control the whole time and we were obedient.